From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A new report shows the extent of public employee union funding in Democratic politics as a new lawsuit tries to overturn Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's landmark union reform, Act 10. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board members Colin Levy and Mene Ukwe-Barua. Colin, let's start today with the Journal's editorial. The headline is Government Unions Love Democrats, and here's how it opens. The alliance between Democrats and public unions is a dominant feature of modern politics, and the mutual love is growing. And it is based on a new report out how government unions fund politics across the country from the Commonwealth Foundation. Can you take us through what the report says? What are some of the numbers it raises and the argument that its authors are making?
Sure, Kyle. I think this report is really interesting because it tells us, in essence, what we already know, but even more so. What we see here is that the amount of money that unions are spending on politics currently is just groundbreaking. They spent $708 million on politics during the 2021-2022 election cycle. And the vast majority of that money is going to Democrats. Some of it is going to Democrats at the federal level, but as we've seen in many places over the past year or so, an inordinate amount of that money is going to Democrats at the state level, where unions have really learned that they can have a huge impact because they can go into these state legislatures and find particular leaders who really need the money for their campaigns. Donate lavishly, make sure that all of their political action committees are behind these candidates. And then when it comes time for their pet legislation, whether it has to do with pension reform or school choice or any number of other things that the unions care about, those legislators really come through for them. So I think what's really interesting to look at here, too, out of this report I found is that membership dues, we always think of a lot of union spending as coming from a particular carved out fund that members say, yes, we want to participate in politics. But in fact, membership dues accounted for almost 60% of all the union political spending. So it's interesting to know that many workers, when they are in a union, may not know how much of their money is going to fund politics and going to fund politics in many cases even out of their state.
And it's important to mention that figure you raised, more than $700 million in 2021 and 2022, that refers to a relatively small group of these unions. Here is from the Commonwealth Foundation report. The four largest government unions, the National Education Association, American Federation for Teachers, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and Service Employees International Union, spent $708 million on politics. And some of the states and candidates are the people that you might expect in the places that you might expect. So there's a graph in here of political action committee spending in state and local elections, and leading the field is Illinois, then California, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, but some that you might not expect. The report says Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro was the top recipient of government union money, taking in over $4.5 million. And Mene, I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that the Journal's editorial says that, for example, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson got about 80% of his campaign funds from union sources. And that, I think, is a story that has been told. But this influence goes deeper in places that people might not think about as union-dominated states like Pennsylvania, where they are still having a live debate, including Governor Josh Shapiro, about whether and how far to go on school choice.
Oh, that's a great point. I think it shows that basically all Democratic politicians in this country, and particularly at the state level, have deep relationships with the public unions and depend on them for quite a lot of their funding. But that includes Democrats of different political stripes. You have folks like Brandon Johnson, who are union members themselves or former union members, who have deep relationships with the unions and who really are running with the unions as their primary base of support, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of votes, which is very possible to do at the city level, where public employees like teachers and other industries make up a huge share of voter turnout. But you also do have candidates like Josh Shapiro, who present themselves as more moderate, potentially more business friendly. But still, if you're running as a Democrat at the state level, you're going to have a relationship with the unions generally to succeed in the primary campaign, to make it past the other candidates you're vying for the nomination with, but also to get across the line in the general election in terms of the money you need to spend. And so these unions might think that Josh Shapiro is on the fence about some of their issues, with school choice being primary among them. And so that makes them even more inclined to actually exert quite a lot of leverage and see if they can keep even moderates in their corner. So far, they've succeeded in Pennsylvania. Shapiro, by his own lights, really seemed like he wanted to approve an expansion of school choice in the state. He also accepted contributions from school choice advocates, some of whom are more right-leaning. But the fact that he has this countervailing interest from the unions that he needs to satisfy prevented him from acting as dramatically and as quickly as he might have wanted to do. And so you always see these unions vying to exert influence on Democrats across the political spectrum. It isn't only the Brandon Johnsons of the world who enter office specifically to do the bidding of the unions, but in many cases, you do have Democrats who are more moderate being restrained by them. So that's something that voters should be aware of as well.
Colin, you mentioned the share of this money that is coming from membership dues as 60%. And I think that's also a key part of this story, because unions have free speech just like any other organization, any company. They are free to get into the political arena and make public arguments about policies that they think are better or worse, or the way that the state government should handle certain issues. But there has been controversy over how much of that money is coming from members who may not agree or know that that money is being spent that way. And there's been some litigation on that. There was a case out of Illinois in 2018, the Supreme Court ruled, called Janus, involving mandatory fair share fees that were collected and going to the union to cover collective bargaining. And so my understanding is that there's some sort of litigation still percolating on this issue, including how people who don't want to be part of the public union, how onerous and confusing the terms can be about leaving, if they have to be able to leave at a moment's notice, or whether the union can set up their authorization such that the employee has to leave during a certain period every year. But I also just wonder how many people are union members and don't realize that their union is spending their money this way.
I think that's a good point, Kyle. I think what we've seen here is that many of the union members join the union because they just assume that's going to be part of their work life. But where the politics money goes really hides behind a veil, not only because it's not cleared explicitly with members, but in many cases because, it's funneled out through other political action committees, or it goes through independent spending. There's other ways for it to get there. And the Commonwealth Report notes an interesting example. There have been times where the actual things that the unions are doing are quite contrary to their own members' interests. The report notes that in 2023, there was a bill in Tennessee that Tennessee Governor Bill Lee signed that would have increased minimum teacher salaries during the 2026-2027 school year. And then very shortly thereafter, the Tennessee Education Association, which is the main teachers union, filed a lawsuit to prevent it from taking effect. And you have to think that those teachers, if they'd seen the whole thing play out and were watching it carefully, would have wondered what exactly their union was thinking. Isn't the whole purpose of a union to ensure that their salaries are rising and going up and competitive with other private sector salaries and all those things that unions present themselves to their members as adding value? But in fact, the reason that they did that was that the bill had another provision that would have prevented automatic dues deductions. And automatic dues deductions are how the unions get their cash. It means that without the employees actually having to kick the money specifically over to the union every month, it just automatically comes out of their paychecks. That is the bread and butter of these operations. It's how they get their political power. So they were clearly in that case acting in their own interests, not in the interests of their members.
And don't forget the interests of the public, because that's the other piece of this that I think is often missed in this debate. Because, Monet, when you have a union that is working hard and getting out members and spending money, big sums of money, to elect a mayor or a governor, and then they go into contract negotiations, and the mayor and the governor is supposed to be the person on the other side of the bargaining table who is looking out for the public and trying to make sure that salaries are competitive, but there's not a bonus for being a member of these public unions. Instead, what you often see is you see the politicians going out in front of these rallies of union members and saying things like, we are going to fight for the best contract. And then everyone applauds and there are big cheers. And this is sort of just an expected dynamic of political campaigning now on the Democratic side of the aisle. And yet I can understand how a member of the public, a taxpayer, would think, wait a second, that's the guy who is supposed to be fighting for a good deal for us, for the taxpayers and the people.
Exactly. You've seen this in state after state. Governors who essentially, when it comes time for renewing a collective bargaining agreement with teachers or with other public workers every few years, goes into this negotiation essentially with a done deal. The union representatives present their terms and they are swiftly approved. They're able to get very substantial raises in addition to benefits packages, particularly healthcare, that are completely unmatched by anything in the private sector, and also the pensions that they have, which are one of a kind, and which in many states performers have failed to actually bring back within the realm of fiscal responsibility, despite the fact that they're creating massive drains on the state fisc, as you see in Illinois. And so the public bargaining advantage that these unions have really is something that is a drain on state resources. And yet that's the mandate of a lot of these Democratic governors, is to protect those benefits. And you don't really see the kind of oppositional bargaining that a union structure is supposed to take place under, and which it generally does in the private sector.